Founder fans, Jason here, and today's founder is George Washington. And while there's so much to say about Washington, today we'll be focusing on the first presidential veto. If you're new here, make sure you subscribe for videos 5 days a week, and either way, hit like on your way in or your way out. So let's talk about George Washington. In 1791, the first census was completed. It was called for in the Constitution, and back then it took a little bit longer than it takes today to count everyone, but it was done, and the population was decided on. Now, when the Constitution was first passed, they chose members of the House of Representatives kind of because it seemed right, and they all agreed, yeah, this seems right for now. But then once the first census was done, they could do it according to the Constitution, which is by population. So they counted up all the people, and each delegate, there was supposed to be one delegate for every 30,000 citizens. So what they did is they counted up all the people, and they divided it by 30,000, and now they have the number of House of Representatives in the House of Representatives. But they made a law to pass to get the next session of Congress the right amount of representatives, and what they did is they just took the number of representatives and divided it up by the states they thought should get more. It wasn't necessarily by population, it was just whoever was more powerful. Now, interestingly, during the Constitutional Convention itself, many Southerners wanted to count slaves among the population, but at the same time they considered slaves property. And there was an interesting conversation had several times during the Constitutional Convention where, of course, there were people who just wanted to not count slaves and eliminate slavery, but many people in the North said, if you're going to count your slaves, which you consider property, to your amount of representatives, why can't I count my property? I own a lot of buildings in New York City. Shouldn't that count? So essentially, although they decided no, it would just be population, essentially, when they made this first law to designate delegates to the House of Representatives, they had that same conversation. And certain places that had more wealth said, we should get more people than little Delaware or Rhode Island. So what happened was it goes to George Washington, and George Washington is undecided. The Constitution obviously seems to indicate that it should be evenly divided by population, but it doesn't seem to specifically say that. And, you know, he didn't really want to veto laws. We're more accustomed to vetoing today, but no law had ever been vetoed before. So George Washington calls in his cabinet, and Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson and Attorney General Edmund Randolph think he should veto the bill because obviously the Constitution says this way. But Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton and Secretary of War Henry Knox say, no, we should pass the law. It's not clear in the Constitution, and even if it is a little skirting the rules, this is better for everyone because the more powerful states will have more say. Now, surprisingly, George Washington, who usually sided with Alexander Hamilton, actually sides with Thomas Jefferson and Edmund Randolph on this one and decides to, for the first time in the history of the United States, veto a bill passed by Congress. And it does get vetoed. Goes back to Congress, and Congress now, for the first time, is put in a position where they can either try and override the president's veto with a 2/3 majority or write a new bill to send back through Congress and over to the president to sign. And while they do consider attempting to override this bill, they know they just don't have the votes, especially against a decision made by George Washington, who at this time was still looming pretty large in the country. So they end up writing another bill where they simply follow the rule that we are now accustomed to. This is a precedent set because every few years they make a new law about how many people are in the House of Representatives and how it's delegated every 10 years with each census it's done. And we've since this time followed Washington's precedent that he set where it's divided by population. And I do want to make one other interesting note, is we no longer follow the Constitution when we decide how many people are in the House of Representatives. Right now it's 335 people, which seems like a lot, but if we followed the original plan of one delegate for every 30,000 people, right now the U.S. House of Representatives would have 11,500 members in it. And that seems to be too many for anything to get done. Not that anything seems to get done nowadays, but we don't talk about modern politics here. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, like I said, subscribe, hit like. I'll be back with another founder for you tomorrow.